They say that the walls of a grand house don't just hold memories, they hold breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale the secrets they've gathered over 40 years. My name is Beatrice Sterling, though most people in the medical and real estate world only know me as the silent shadow behind the Sterling Haven empire. For 4 decades, I have walked the marble floors of our estate, adjusted the silk curtains, and played the role of the devoted, quiet wife. I was a cardiac surgeon once, a woman who understood the precision of a heartbeat and the fragile architecture of a life, but I traded my scalpel for a supporting role in my husband's theater. I thought I was building a sanctuary for my family, a legacy of healing and comfort that would outlast us all. But standing in the center of our grand ballroom tonight, surrounded by the scent of expensive lilies and the hollow chime of crystal, I realized that I hadn't built a home. I had built a gilded cage, and the people I loved most were the ones tightening the lock. They looked at my silver hair and my simple pearls and saw a woman who had faded into the wallpaper, someone whose only remaining purpose was to serve as a backdrop for their brilliance. They had no idea that I was still the surgeon I had always been, observing every tremor, every lie, and every hidden motive, with a clarity they would soon learn to fear. Before we continue uncovering the secrets hidden within the Sterling mansion, after you take a second to hit the like button and leave a warm comment, I want to wish health and peace to all of you watching. I wonder, how old are you today? What city are you in? And what time is it there right now? Let's continue. The evening was supposed to be a celebration of 40 years of marriage, a diamond anniversary. The Sterling Haven Resort, the crown jewel of our medical hospitality empire, was bathed in a soft, amber glow that made everything look more expensive than it already was. I stood near the edge of the buffet, smoothing the fabric of my navy silk gown, feeling the weight of the years more than the weight of the occasion. Arthur, my husband, was in his element. He stood at the head of the long, mahogany table, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his tan glowing under the chandeliers. He was a man who commanded the air in any room he entered, a man who had mastered the art of the charming smile that never quite reached his eyes. "May I have everyone's attention?" Arthur's voice boomed, rich and authoritative, the kind of voice that had convinced investors to pour millions into our projects. The room went silent. I saw our youngest son, Julian, leaning against a pillar with a glass of scotch in his hand, his eyes wandering toward the young waitresses rather than his father. Beside him stood Elena, our daughter-in-law, a woman whose ambition was as sharp as her stilettos. 40 years, Arthur began, raising his champagne flute. 40 years ago, I started with a vision of a place where healing met luxury. And through every merger, every construction delay, and every board meeting, I had one constant by my side: Beatrice. He turned to me, and for a fleeting second, a stranger might have thought he looked at me with love. But I saw the calculation. I saw the way he used my presence to soften his own ruthless image. Most of you know her as the woman who keeps our home running, the heart of our family. She chose to leave her career in medicine to ensure our children were raised with traditional values and that I had a peaceful sanctuary to return to after a long day of building an empire. B, thank you for being the world's most dedicated homemaker. A polite ripple of applause went through the room. I felt a familiar, dull ache in my chest. Homemaker. It was the word he used like a shroud to cover the fact that I was the one who had designed the integrated medical protocols for Sterling Haven. I was the one who had spent 18-hour days in the early 90s mapping out the logistics of patient care that had made our resorts famous. Arthur provided the face and the funding, but I had provided the soul and the science. To him, and now to the world, I was just the woman who picked out the floral arrangements and made sure dinner was served at 7. Dad's being modest as usual, Julian piped up, his voice cutting through the quiet as he stepped forward. He didn't look at me. He looked at the guests, playing his own role. Mom's greatest achievement isn't just the house. It's the fact that she's stayed so blissfully uncomplicated in such a high-tech world. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that made the ice in his glass clink. I tried to show her how to use the new Sterling Haven Investor app yesterday, and she looked at me like I was speaking ancient Greek. She still insists on writing everything down in those little leather notebooks of hers. Honestly, in a family of sharks, it's nice to have a goldfish who doesn't even know how to use a banking app. The room chuckled. It was a light, affectionate laugh, the kind of laugh people use when they pity someone. Elena smirked, tapping a finger against her chin, her eyes scanning me as if she were appraising an old piece of furniture that no longer fit the decor. I caught Arthur's gaze. He didn't defend me. He didn't correct them. He simply offered a patronizing shrug, as if to say, asterisk. Well, that's just how she is. Asterisk. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. They were the hands of a woman who had once held a human heart and stitched it back together. I thought about the notebook in my purse, the one Julian mocked. It wasn't filled with grocery lists or garden sketches. It was filled with the observations I had been making for months, the discrepancies in the resort's offshore maintenance accounts, the secret meetings Arthur had been having with our biggest competitor, and the legal drafts I had spotted on Elena's laptop that mentioned mental competency and transfer of guardianship. They thought I was slow because I didn't move at their frantic, greedy pace. They thought I was disconnected because I chose to listen rather than speak. They had mistaken my silence for absence and my grace for weakness. "I think I'll go get some air," I said softly, my voice barely audible above the resumed chatter. Arthur didn't even turn his head. He was already deep in conversation with a senator about a new zoning permit. Julian was busy showing Elena something on his phone, likely the very app he claimed I couldn't understand. I walked toward the French doors leading to the terrace, the cool night air of the Atlantic coast hitting my face like a splash of cold water. The party continued behind me, a symphony of vanity and hidden daggers. I stood by the stone railing, looking out over the dark expanse of the ocean, and for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace. The humiliation of the evening hadn't broken me. It had finished the job of detaching me from the people I had once called my world. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and felt the small, cold weight of a key I had found earlier that week, tucked away in an old medical text in my study. It belonged to a desk that had once been Martha's, my mother-in-law. Martha had been the one who truly saw me, the one who had whispered on her deathbed that the Sterling men were builders of sandcastles who would eventually be washed away by the tide. As I stood there, a shadow moved at the edge of the garden near the rose bushes Martha had planted 40 years ago. A man in a charcoal suit, someone who didn't look like an invited guest, stood there watching the house. He wasn't looking at the lights or the celebrities. He was looking directly at me. He didn't move, didn't wave. He simply stood there, a silent sentinel in the dark. I realized then that the theater of the ballroom was ending, and the real play was about to begin. My husband and son had spent the night trying to convince the world I was a non-entity, a woman who couldn't manage a smartphone, let alone a multi-million-dollar corporation. They were so busy laughing at the goldfish that they never noticed the tide was coming in, and the tide, unlike Arthur Sterling, never forgets what it's owed. The atmosphere of a gala is a strange thing. It's designed to make you feel like you're at the center of the world, but as I stood on that terrace, I had never felt more invisible. For 40 years I had been the steady pulse beneath the Sterling name, the one who caught the falling pieces and tucked them away so the image of perfection never cracked. I had watched Arthur build his monuments of glass and steel, always standing exactly 3 steps behind him, nodding when I was supposed to, and smiling until my face felt like a mask of dried clay. But tonight, the air felt different. It was thick with the scent of salt water and the cold realization that my husband and son weren't just overlooking me anymore, they were actively trying to erase me. They saw a woman whose best days were stored in photo albums, a goldfish in a tank of their own making. What they didn't understand is that when you spend 4 decades being quiet, you learn how to hear the things people don't say. You learn to read the tension in a handshake and the predatory glint in a lawyer's eye. As that silent stranger in the charcoal suit moved out of the shadows of the garden and began walking toward the French doors, I didn't feel afraid. I felt a sudden, sharp jolt of recognition. It was as if a ghost from a life I'd almost forgotten was finally coming to claim a debt, and for the first time in a long time I was ready to listen. I stepped back into the warmth of the ballroom, the sound of the string quartet humming like a distant hive of bees. The stranger didn't head for the bar or the buffet. He moved with a deliberate, slow grace that felt out of place among the jittery, high-energy guests. He looked like he was made of old leather and parchment, a man who had spent his life in rooms filled with heavy books and hushed secrets. His hair was a stark, wintry white, and his eyes, when they finally met mine, were as sharp as a surgeon's needle. I felt Arthur's hand on my lower back, a gesture that looked affectionate to the crowd, but felt like a firm, controlling grip to me. "B, you've been wandering," he whispered, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and triumph. "Come back to the table. The CEO of Vanguard Dirkfum is looking for you. Just smile and tell him how much you love the new conservatory." "Arthur," I started to say, but the stranger had already reached us. He stopped exactly 2 feet away, ignoring Arthur entirely. It was a calculated insult, one so subtle that only someone like me would catch the twitch in Arthur's jaw. "Beatrice Sterling," the man said. His voice was a low, resonant rasp, like a cello played in a small room. "It has been a very long time." Arthur's grip tightened on my waist. "I'm sorry, do we know you? This is a private celebration." The man finally shifted his gaze to Arthur, and the corners of his mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I am Silas Vance. I was Martha Sterling's personal legal counsel for 30 years. I believe I handled your father's estate as well, Arthur, though I imagine you've found more flexible representation since then." Arthur's face went stiff. Silas Vance was a name I hadn't heard in 2 decades. He was a legend in the old money circles of Boston, a man known for his terrifying integrity and his absolute loyalty to the Sterling matriarch, Martha. Arthur had fired him within a week of Martha's funeral, replacing him with a firm that specialized in creative asset management. "Silas," I breathed, stepping forward, effectively breaking Arthur's hold on me. "I thought you had retired to the Cape." "Martha made sure I could never truly retire from her service, Beatrice," Silas said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a silk handkerchief, along with a cream-colored envelope. "She gave me very specific instructions. I was to wait until this exact anniversary." She said, "Silas, wait until the diamond has lost its shine and the walls begin to close in. Only then will she be ready to see what I saw." A sudden silence seemed to drop over our small circle, even though the party rumbled on around us. Julian appeared at his father's elbow, his face flushed from the bar, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the envelope in Silas's hand. "What is that?" Julian asked, his voice slurring slightly, but sharp with greed. "Is that a codicil? Some kind of hidden trust?" Silas didn't even look at the boy. He kept his eyes on me. "This is not for the estate at large, Beatrice. This is for you, personally." Julian stepped in, his hand reaching out with the clumsy entitlement of a child who had never been told no. "If it's Sterling business, it goes through the legal team. Give it here, old man. I'll make sure it gets to the right office." Julian's fingers brushed the silk, but I was faster. It was a reflex I hadn't used in years, the speed of a surgeon catching a slipping instrument. I snatched the handkerchief and the envelope from Silas's hand and tucked them firmly against my chest. The weight of the object inside the silk was cold and hard. A key. "It's mine, Julian," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "Your grandmother didn't send Silas here to talk to the legal team. She sent him to talk to me." Arthur's face was a map of suppressed rage. He couldn't make a scene, not with the Vanguard executives watching, but his eyes were dark with a predatory curiosity. Don't be dramatic. It's probably just some sentimental trinket or an old letter. Give it to me. I'll put it in the safe for you, so you don't lose it in the chaos." "I won't lose it, Arthur," I said, meeting his gaze. For the first time in 40 years, I didn't look away. "I think I've spent enough time letting you keep things safe for me." Silas Vance bowed his head slightly, a small spark of satisfaction in his ancient eyes. "Inside the envelope, you will find an address in the north end of Boston, an old brownstone on Salem Street. Martha kept the deed in her maiden name. Go there, Beatrice. Alone. And use that key." "This is ridiculous," Arthur hissed, stepping closer to Silas. "I'll have you escorted out for harassing my wife." "I'm leaving, Arthur," Silas said, turning away. "I've fulfilled my final obligation to a woman who was far more perceptive than you ever gave her credit for." He looked back at me one last time. "Don't wait, Beatrice. The locks on Salem Street are old, but they are the only ones that still hold the truth." He disappeared into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there, the silk-wrapped key burning against my palm. Julian was hovering, his breath smelling of tobacco, his eyes fixed on the envelope I had tucked into my silk clutch. "Mom, seriously, let me see that," Julian pressured, his tone shifting to that fake, whining sweetness he used when he wanted a favor. "You know how weird Grandma Martha got at the end. It could be some legal nightmare that messes with the resort's valuation. Elena is a lawyer. She can look at it in 5 minutes and tell us if it's garbage." "It isn't garbage, Julian," I said, feeling a surge of protective instinct that surprised me. "And it isn't business, it's family." I turned away from them, walking back toward the center of the room, but I could feel their eyes on my back like heat. I knew Arthur was already signaling Elena, and I knew Julian would be looking for my purse the moment I went to the restroom. The goldfish had just been handed a key to the ocean, and the sharks were finally beginning to realize that the water was getting deeper. As I looked at the glittering crowd, I didn't see friends or colleagues anymore. I saw a house built on a foundation of secrets, and I realized that Martha hadn't just left me a key. She had left me a detonator. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in a house where people are keeping secrets from one another. It isn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home. It's a heavy, vibrating tension, like the air right before a massive thunderstorm breaks. I've lived in that silence for a long time, but after Silas Vance left the party, the quiet felt different. It felt like a countdown. For years, I told myself that the distance between Arthur and me was just the natural erosion of time, the way a river slowly wears down a stone until it's smooth and featureless. I chose to believe his lies because the truth felt too heavy to carry while I was trying to keep our family together. But as I sat in the darkness of my bedroom later that night, clutching the silk-wrapped key Silas had given me, I realized that I hadn't been a partner in this marriage. I had been a project to be managed, a variable to be controlled. The people I shared my breakfast with, the people whose brows I had wiped when they were sick, were looking at me and seeing an obstacle. They didn't see the woman who had sacrificed her surgical career to build their world. They saw a sunset they were waiting to disappear. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through the heavy velvet curtains, I knew I couldn't wait until I got to Boston to start looking for answers. The rot wasn't just in the legacy Silas had mentioned. It was right here, in the very floorboards beneath my feet. The morning after the anniversary party, the house felt like a hollow shell. Arthur had left early, claiming an urgent meeting with the Vanguard executives, and Julian and Elena were supposedly at the resort's fitness center. I stood in the kitchen, watching the steam rise from my tea, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. It was a normal Tuesday, yet everything felt fractured. My mind kept returning to the way Julian had reached for that envelope, the hunger in his eyes. It wasn't the curiosity of a son, it was the desperation of a predator. I knew Arthur's study was off limits. He'd had a biometric lock installed 3 years ago, telling me it was for corporate security. But Arthur had a weakness common to men of his generation. He was predictable. He used the same 6-digit string for everything the date he'd made his first million, a date I had helped him calculate during a long night of financial planning decades ago. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood before the heavy oak door. I felt like a thief in my own home, a stranger trespassing on a life I had helped build. The lock chirped, the green light flickered, and the door clicked open with a heavy, expensive thud. The room smelled of old paper, cedar, and the expensive cigars Arthur smoked when he thought I wasn't looking. I didn't go for his desk first. Arthur was too smart to leave anything there. Instead, I went to the built-in bookshelves in the corner, specifically to the section housing his vintage medical journals. Behind a row of leather-bound volumes of The Lancet Times from the 1980s, I found a slim, metallic briefcase. It didn't belong in the room. It was too modern, too sleek. I took it to the floor, my fingers trembling so much I nearly dropped it. It wasn't locked. Arthur's arrogance was his second greatest weakness. He truly believed I would never set foot in this room. The first thing I saw was a folder labeled BS Health Evaluation. My breath hitched. Inside were documents on Elena's law firm letterhead. They weren't medical records, they were drafts. Affidavits from specialists I had never met, describing symptoms of severe clinical depression, early onset cognitive decline, and unpredictable emotional instability. I read the words over and over, the letters swimming before my eyes just like the puzzles of my youth. They were building a case. They weren't just trying to sideline me. They were preparing to have me declared legally incompetent. Elena had mapped it out with surgical precision. The timeline for the filing, the specific board members who would be briefed on my deteriorating state, and the legal mechanism that would transfer my voting rights in the Sterling Haven Empire to Arthur and Julian. "Oh, Arthur," I whispered into the cold air of the study. A sob threatened to break out, but I swallowed it down. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. This was the man I had slept beside for 40 years. This was the woman I had welcomed into my family with open arms. They were dissecting my life while I was still living it. But the folders went deeper. At the bottom of the briefcase was a smaller, unmarked envelope. Inside were photographs, not digital prints, but real, physical photos. They showed Arthur at a private villa in the Caymans. He wasn't alone. Beside him, her hand resting familiarly on his arm, was Sylvia Vane, the co-founder of Vane Medical, our fiercest competitor for the last decade. There were letters, too, handwritten ones. Arthur's handwriting, usually so stiff and formal, was loose and passionate. They dated back 10 years. 10 years of business trips to Zurich and Singapore. 10 years of him telling me he was working late to ensure our future, when he was actually planning a merger that went far beyond business. Sylvia wasn't just a mistress. The letters discussed a final exit strategy, a plan to sell Sterling Haven to Vane Medical, effectively liquidating the legacy I had built and leaving me with nothing but a court-mandated allowance and a room in a high-end care facility. I sat there on the Persian rug, the evidence of my life's betrayal scattered around me like autumn leaves. The shock was a physical weight, pressing the air out of my lungs. I thought of every dinner I'd cooked, every sacrifice I'd made, every time I'd quieted my own voice so he could roar. It had all been for a man who had spent a decade plotting my erasure. I heard the distant sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My time was up. I moved with a speed I didn't know I still possessed. I didn't take the originals that would alert him. Instead, I pulled out my phone. Julian had mocked me for not knowing how to use the investor app, but he had forgotten that I was a surgeon. I was trained to master complex tools. I photographed every page, every legal draft, every picture, and every letter. My hands were perfectly still now, the tremor gone, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it. I wiped the dust from the shelf, closed the briefcase, and reset the books. I walked out of that study and closed the door just as I heard Arthur's voice in the foyer, calling out to the housekeeper. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, standing by the window just as I had 20 minutes before. When Arthur walked in, looking frustrated and tired, he came over and kissed my cheek. He smelled of the same cedar and cigars from the study. "Everything okay, Bea?" he asked, his voice dripping with that practiced, condescending warmth. "You look a little pale. Maybe you should lie down. The party was a lot for you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't see my husband. I saw a patient with a terminal heart condition, one that no surgery could fix. "I'm fine, Arthur," I said, offering him a small, tight smile, the kind of smile he expected. "I think I'm just going to take a little trip to Boston, to see Silas Vance's old neighborhood, for the nostalgia." Arthur paused, his glass of water halfway to his lips. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face, followed quickly by a dismissive smirk. "If you think you need the distraction, go ahead. Just don't get lost, dear. The North End can be quite a maze for someone who isn't used to it." "I won't get lost," I promised him, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I think I'm finally starting to see exactly where I am." He patted my hand and walked away, already checking his phone. He had no idea that the goldfish had just found the map to the shark's lair, and I wasn't planning on swimming away. I was planning on changing the tide. The hardest part about being underestimated isn't the insults, it's the way people stop hiding who they really are when they think you're too small to matter. For months, I had moved through the hallways of the Sterling estate like a ghost, catching fragments of conversations that ended abruptly whenever I entered a room, and watching the way Arthur and Julian exchanged those knowing, pitying glances over the dinner table. They saw a woman who was slowly losing her grip on reality, someone who struggled with the remote control and needed help navigating a simple iPad. What they forgot, what they had willfully chosen to erase from their memories, was that I had spent 25 years performing microsurgery. My hands were trained to navigate the most delicate pathways of the human heart, and my mind was built to solve complex puzzles under extreme pressure while a life literally hung in the balance. When you are a surgeon, you don't just look, you observe. You look for the minute tremor, the irregular rhythm, the subtle shift in pressure that signals a crisis before it happens. Standing in my kitchen after discovering the briefcase in Arthur's study, I felt that old, familiar focus return. It was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear. I wasn't just a discarded wife or a blissfully uncomplicated homemaker. I was the one who knew how to dissect a lie without leaving a mark, and it was time to start operating. The next few days required a performance of a different kind. I played the role they wanted, the slightly confused, aging woman who was suddenly very concerned about the quality of the air. I mentioned it at breakfast, complaining of a phantom cough, and again over dinner, until Arthur gave one of his dismissive sighs and told me to just buy whatever I needed to feel better. He even handed me his corporate credit card, patting my hand as if I were a child asking for a new toy. "Buy the best ones, Bea. Just don't bother me with the details," he'd said. I didn't buy the standard HEPA filters from a local hardware store. Instead, I reached out to a contact from my days at the hospital, a specialist in medical-grade environmental monitoring. Under the guise of installing high-end air purification systems throughout the house, I had him order units that were customized. These weren't just filters, they were sophisticated nodes of a private network. Tucked inside the sleek white casings were high-definition, low-light lenses, and omnidirectional microphones designed for acoustic analysis in surgical theaters. Installing them was the easy part. I spent the afternoons while the house was empty, moving with the precision I used to employ in the OR. I placed them in the study, the dining room, and the small sunroom where Julian and Elena liked to retreat with their laptops. I calibrated the sensors to trigger at the sound of specific voices. While Arthur and Julian saw me struggling to understand the investor app, I was actually using a hidden partition on my tablet to sync the encrypted feed from the air purifiers. If you have ever been the one to sacrifice everything for your family only to receive indifference in return, you will understand what Beatrice is feeling right now. Please stay a little longer because the story is about to shift toward a truth that even Arthur didn't expect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss her next steps. By Thursday night, the data began to pour in. I sat in my darkened bedroom, the glow of the tablet reflecting in my glasses, and began to perform the most important surgery of my life. I wasn't looking at blood vessels anymore. I was looking at the flow of money. Arthur had always kept the Sterling Haven financial reports in a simplified format for me, claiming the raw data was too dry for my artistic mind. But I had the raw data now. I had the digital keystrokes recorded from his study and the high-resolution images of the ledgers he thought were hidden. As I scrolled through the spreadsheets, my eyes began to catch the patterns, the irregular rhythms in the corporate pulse. There were massive, recurring transfers of capital from the Sterling Haven Emergency Reserve Fund, money meant for hospital equipment and facility maintenance, moving into a series of shell companies I didn't recognize. I cross-referenced the dates of these transfers with Julian's social media posts and travel logs. The correlation was sickeningly perfect. Every time Julian went to Macau or spent a week in a private villa in Monaco, a fresh facility upgrade was recorded in the books for a resort that hadn't seen a new coat of paint in 3 years. Arthur wasn't just planning to sell the company to Sylvia Vane, he was actively gutting the company's internal organs to cover Julian's spiraling gambling debts. I watched a video feed from that afternoon. Julian was in the sunroom, pacing back and forth, his face flushed and sweating. Elena was sitting on the sofa, her expression cold and calculating as she looked at a legal document. "The Vanguard merger is taking too long," Julian's voice came through the speakers, cracked with desperation. "The guys in Vegas aren't going to wait another month, Elena. They've already called the house twice this week. If Dad doesn't move another $500,000 by Friday, I'm dead." Elena didn't even look up from her screen. "Relax, Julian. Arthur is handling the competency filing. Once the court appoints him as Beatrice's legal guardian, her 40% voting block is his. He'll push the Vane merger through, the liquidation will happen, and your debts will disappear into the paperwork. You just need to keep playing the worried son. Don't mess this up by acting like a panicked addict in front of her." "She doesn't notice anything," Julian scoffed, taking a heavy swallow from a tumbler of scotch. "She's too busy worried about the dust in the air." "It's pathetic." I sat in the dark, the tablet trembling in my hands. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't just a husband's infidelity or a son's greed. It was a total, coordinated effort to strip me of my dignity, my legacy, and my mind. They were counting on my slowness, my disability to see the world as it truly was. But as I looked at the screen, I realized they had made a fatal error. They had forgotten that a surgeon doesn't panic when she finds a tumor. She prepares the tray, she cleans the site, and then she begins to cut. I began to export the files, the recorded conversations, the decrypted bank transfers, the gambling logs, and the evidence of Arthur's embezzlement. I organized them into a digital dossier labeled Final Procedure. Arthur thought he was managing a declining wife. Julian thought he was outsmarting a goldfish. Neither of them realized that I had already mapped out their every move, and for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't the one who was going to be silenced. I had the key to the North End, and I had the evidence of their crimes. Tomorrow, I would leave for Boston, and by the time I returned, the Sterling Empire would realize that the heart of this family had finally stopped beating for them and started beating for herself. The drive from our estate to the north end of Boston usually takes about an hour, but that morning, every mile felt like a year stripping away from my life. I watched the familiar skyline emerge through the gray Atlantic mist, thinking about how many times I had visited this city as the doctor's wife, attending fundraisers and nodding at the right people while Arthur took the stage. For decades, I had been a passenger in my own existence, looking out the window while someone else held the wheel. But as I clutched the steering wheel of my modest sedan, the heavy brass key Silas Vance had given me sat in the cup holder, glowing like a promise in the morning light. I realized then that my mother-in-law, Martha, hadn't just left me a property or a secret, she had left me a mirror. She was a woman who had been silenced by the same lineage of sterling men, a woman who had walked these same cobblestone streets with a heart full of unspoken truths. She knew that Arthur's greed wasn't a phase, but a bloodline trait, a hunger that consumed everything in its path. I felt her presence beside me in the quiet car, a ghostly hand guiding me toward a small, weathered brownstone on Salem Street that the world had forgotten, but that held the only truth I had left. The North End has a way of holding on to the past, its narrow alleys smelling of roasted espresso and damp stone, a stark contrast to the sterile glass and steel luxury of the resorts Arthur built. I found the address Silas had mentioned, a 3-story brick building tucked between an old Italian bakery and a shuttered tailor shop. The exterior was unremarkable, the red brick darkened by decades of city soot, but as I stepped up to the heavy oak door and slid the key into the lock, my hand didn't tremble. The mechanism turned with a smooth, oiled click that spoke of meticulous maintenance, as if the house itself had been waiting for my touch. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender and old books. It wasn't a dusty ruin. It was a sanctuary. Martha had kept this place in her maiden name, a secret fortress that Arthur never knew existed. I walked through the small parlor, my heels clicking softly on the polished hardwood, and found myself drawn to a small rug in the corner of the library. It was slightly askew, revealing a brass ring set into the floorboards. My knees creaked as I knelt, pulling the ring. The trapdoor opened easily, revealing a steep set of wooden stairs leading into a finished basement that felt more like an archive than a cellar. It was lined with filing cabinets and a sturdy mahogany desk. On the desk sat an old-fashioned reel-to-reel tape recorder and a stack of carefully labeled boxes. I sat in Martha's chair, the leather worn and comfortable, and reached for the box labeled Times 2006. The final confrontation. Asterisk. My heart hammered against my ribs as I threaded the tape through the machine, just as I used to do with medical recording equipment during my residency. When I pressed play, the hiss of the tape filled the small room, followed by the sound of a door slamming. "You're being unreasonable, Mother." A younger, sharper version of Arthur's voice filled the room. It sent a chill down my spine. "The board is ready to move. We need the land titles transferred to the corporate entity now. This sentimental attachment to the Boston holdings is standing in the way of the Sterling legacy. The legacy you're building is made of hollow promises, Arthur," Martha's voice responded. She sounded tired, but there was a steel in her tone that I recognized, the same steel I was finally finding in myself. "I've seen how you treat Beatrice. You treat her like a beautiful piece of equipment that you've retired to the attic. You think because she's quiet, she's not watching. But she is the only one in this family with a soul left." "Beatrice is a homemaker," Arthur snapped. "She doesn't understand the complexities of real estate. She has everything she needs. Now, sign the papers. I've already had the lawyers draft the competency clause. If you don't sign, I'll have Silas removed and we will move for a legal guardianship. Don't make me do this to my own mother." There was a long silence on the tape, broken only by the sound of Martha's soft, rhythmic tapping on the desk. "You will do what you must, Arthur, but you should know. I've already made my move. You can have the company, you can have the titles you've stolen, but you will never own the earth beneath your feet." I felt a sob catch in my throat. 20 years ago, he had tried to do to his mother exactly what he was doing to me now. The competency clause, the legal guardianship. It was his signature move, the way he removed anyone who stood between him and his greed. He had gaslighted the woman who gave him life, and he had been doing it to me for half my marriage. I turned my attention to the large envelope at the bottom of the box. Inside was a notarized deed and a final will that Silas Vance had kept hidden in escrow. My eyes blurred as I read the legal descriptions. Martha hadn't just left me the brownstone. She had purchased the 60% of the land titles that the Sterling Haven resorts actually sat upon the ground under the hospitals, the spas, the luxury villas, and she had deeded them directly to me, Beatrice Sterling, in a private trust. Arthur owned the buildings, the branding, and the empire, but I owned the dirt. Without my consent, he couldn't sell a single square inch of the property to Sylvia Vane or the Vanguard Group. He was a king without a kingdom, sitting in a palace built on land he didn't own. I leaned back in the chair, looking at the ceiling, feeling a strange, overwhelming connection to the woman who had sat here before me. Martha had seen the storm coming 2 decades before the first drop of rain hit my face. Bà ấy đã chịu đựng sự bắt nạt của con trai mình, sự sỉ nhục thầm lặng của một gia đình coi trọng lợi nhuận hơn con người, chỉ để chuẩn bị cho tôi một lối thoát. Bà biết tôi sẽ cần thời gian, bà biết tôi sẽ cần phải bị dồn vào đường cùng trước khi tôi tìm thấy sức mạnh để chiến đấu. Thank you, Martha, I whispered into the quiet basement. I spent the next few hours digitizing the recordings and the deeds, my mind working with the cold, clinical efficiency of a surgeon preparing for a complex transplant. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the landlord. Every time Arthur or Julian stepped onto the grounds of the resort, they were trespassing on my property. I looked at the photograph of Martha on the desk. She was smiling, her eyes sharp and knowing. We were 2 generations of women who had been told we were uncomplicated and academic failures in the eyes of the Sterling men. We had been used as social props and emotional anchors while they sailed toward their own destruction. But as I tucked the original deeds into my bag and locked the brownstone door behind me, I felt a weight lift that I had been carrying since I said I do in 1986. I had the recordings of Arthur's abuse of his mother, and I had the legal ownership of his entire world. The men of this family thought they were playing a game of chess against a goldfish, but they had forgotten that even the smallest creature knows the terrain of its home better than the predator hunting it. I wasn't going back to the estate to pack my bags. I was going back to reclaim my house. The Sterling men were about to find out that the foundation they thought was solid was actually shifting beneath them, and for the first time in 40 years, I was the one holding the map. There is a terrifying kind of clarity that comes when you realize the person sharing your bed and the son you carried in your womb have spent their lives treating you like a financial liability. For years, I looked at Arthur and saw a man of ambition, a man who built empires so his family would never know want. I looked at Julian and saw a boy who struggled to find his way, someone whose mistakes were just growing pains that needed a mother's patience. I was so blinded by my own devotion that I mistook their greed for passion and their cruelty for pragmatism. But as I sat in the shadows of that brownstone in Boston, listening to the recorded ghost of my mother-in-law, the scales finally fell from my eyes. A Sterling man doesn't see people, he sees assets. And when an asset is no longer appreciating, he liquidates it. I had spent 40 years being the emotional foundation of their world, thinking my silence was my strength, but they saw it as my permission to be erased. They thought they had backed me into a corner where I would simply sign my name and disappear into a quiet, medicated retirement. They had no idea that I wasn't just a surgeon who knew how to heal. I was a woman who had finally learned exactly where the most vital arteries were hidden. The trap was set, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one walking into it. The evening I returned from Boston, the house felt colder than usual, despite the expensive climate control systems humming in the walls. I had the deeds and the recordings encrypted on my device, tucked away in my purse like a loaded weapon. Arthur was in the sunroom with Julian and Elena. The air was thick with the smell of rich tobacco and the sharp metallic scent of a victory they believed they had already won. As I walked in, the conversation died instantly, replaced by that patronizing, forced cheerfulness that had become their hallmark. "Bea, darling, you're back," Arthur said, not standing up but gesturing to the armchair across from him. "How was your little trip down memory lane? I hope the North End wasn't too taxing for you. You've been looking so fatigued lately." I sat down, smoothing the fabric of my coat, and looked at them. Elena was holding a thick stack of legal documents, her pen poised like a needle. Julian was restless, tapping his foot, his eyes bloodshot and darting around the room. He looked like a man who was running out of time, and based on the financial logs I'd decrypted, he was. "It was enlightening, Arthur," I said softly. "The old neighborhood hasn't changed as much as I thought it would. It has a way of preserving what's important." Arthur exchanged a glance with Elena. He cleared his throat, leaning forward with that boardroom intensity he used to close deals. "Well, while you were away, Julian, Elena and I had a very serious discussion about the future. Of the company, and of you, Bea. We've received an extraordinary offer from Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. They want to acquire the entire Sterling Haven portfolio. It's a massive deal, one that would secure our family for 5 generations. I knew about Vanguard. They were a predatory firm, currently under 3 federal investigations for distributing counterfeit hypertension medication in developing markets. Selling to them wouldn't just be a business move, it would be the death of everything Sterling Haven was supposed to stand for. It would turn our sanctuary of healing into a distribution hub for poison. Vanguard? I asked, keeping my voice level. Their reputation is questionable, isn't it? Julian scoffed, reaching for his drink. Reputation doesn't pay the bills, Mom. They have the capital. And frankly, with the way the market is shifting, we need to get out now before the valuation drops. It's a win-win. And that brings us to this, Elena said, sliding a document across the low marble table toward me. It was a formal voluntary retirement and transfer of executive authority. It was a surrender. By signing it, I would be handing over my 40% voting block and my seat on the board, effectively giving Arthur and Julian the power to bypass any remaining opposition to the Vanguard merger. We've already consulted with Dr. Eris, Arthur added, his voice dropping into that fake empathetic register that made my skin crawl. He agrees that the stress of the current corporate climate is contributing to your episodes. This document allows you to step away with dignity, B. You won't have to worry about meetings or spreadsheets anymore. You can just focus on your health, perhaps spend some time at the new facility in Arizona. It's for the best. I looked down at the paper. It was a map of my own exile. They were asking me to sign away my life's work so they could pay off Julian's gambling debts, and Arthur could move on to his new life with Sylvia Vane. They thought I was so broken, so diminished, that I would simply do as I was told to avoid a confrontation. And if I don't sign this today? I asked, looking up at Elena. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes turned cold. Then we move forward with the competency hearing on Monday, Beatrice. We have the affidavits. We have the records of your confusion and your inability to manage basic tasks. It would be a public process. Very messy. Very embarrassing for the Sterling name. Arthur doesn't want that for you. None of us do. Arthur reached out and patted my hand, his palm dry and cold. Sign it, B. Let's just put this all behind us. We can have a nice dinner, just the family, and start the next chapter. I looked at Arthur, seeing the man who had spent 10 years cheating on me and 20 years bullying his own mother. Then I looked at Julian, the son I had protected, who was now nodding along to his mother's legal execution. I felt a surge of something powerful, a cold fire that started in my gut and moved to my chest. I leaned back, a small, calm smile touching my lips. I didn't reach for the pen. I think I'll wait, I said. Julian jumped to his feet, his frustration boiling over. Wait for what? The deal is on the table, Mom. We need this settled tonight. I think I'll wait until the emergency shareholder meeting tomorrow morning, I continued, my voice steady and clear. I saw Arthur's eyes narrow, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. I've invited the full board and the major investors. I thought it would be more appropriate to discuss the future of the company in a formal setting, rather than over cocktails in the sunroom. Arthur laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. B, you didn't call a meeting. You don't even know how to access the board's calendar. Stop this. It's exactly the kind of delusional behavior that proves our point. Actually, Arthur, I did, I said, standing up. I looked down at them. 3 people who thought they were the masters of the universe, unaware that they were standing on a foundation that had already turned to sand. I also spoke with Margaret Coleman this afternoon. She seemed very interested in the documents I shared with her. It turns out I'm much better with technology than you gave me credit for. I walked toward the door, stopping only to look back at the stack of papers on the table. Keep your pen, Elena, I said. You're going to need it tomorrow. I imagine there will be a lot of notes to take when the board hears what I have to say. Good night, everyone. I suggest you get some rest. It's going to be a very long day. I walked out of the room, leaving a deafening silence behind me. I could almost hear the gears turning in Arthur's head, the frantic panic starting to rise in Julian's chest. They still thought they were the ones in control, that this was just a last-minute flare-up from a dying flame. They had no idea that I had the recordings. They had no idea I owned the land. And most importantly, they had no idea that the goldfish had spent the last 40 years learning exactly how to survive in a sea of sharks. Tomorrow, the Sterling Haven Empire would find out who truly held the power, and I was going to enjoy every second of the revelation. Standing before the tall, reinforced glass doors of the boardroom on the top floor of Sterling Tower, I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. I wasn't the bee who spent her mornings choosing the thread count for resort linens, or the Beatrice who stood mutely at cocktail parties while Arthur explained my own medical theories to men in expensive suits. I was something older, something harder. I was a surgeon who had walked into a theater knowing the patient was already bleeding out, and I was the only one who knew where to apply the pressure. The air in the hallway was sterile and thin, smelling of floor wax and the cold anticipation of a corporate execution. Inside that room, Arthur was likely already smoothing the silk tie I had bought him for his birthday, preparing to sign away the soul of our life's work to a pack of vultures. He thought he had planned for everything, the legal loopholes, the mental competency affidavits, the carefully timed betrayal. But Arthur's fatal flaw has always been his inability to imagine that a woman who has been silent for 40 years might have spent that time memorizing every crack in his foundation. As I reached for the heavy silver handle, I felt Martha's key heavy in my pocket, a grounding weight that reminded me I wasn't just walking into a meeting. I was walking into a reclamation. The boardroom was a cathedral of vanity walnut panels, leather chairs that hissed when you sat in them, and a panoramic view of the coastline that Martha had first secured back in the 60s. When I stepped inside, the room didn't just go quiet, it froze. Arthur was at the head of the table, a fountain pen poised over a thick, leather-bound contract. Elena was to his right, her laptop open, looking like a predator mid-pounce. Julian was leaning back, a smirk playing on his lips that suggested he was already spending the commission from the Vanguard deal. "B?" Arthur's voice was a mixture of shock and a dangerous rising anger. He didn't stand up. "What is this?" "I told you last night, this is a closed session for the board and the principals. You're not supposed to be here." I didn't answer him immediately. I walked to the foot of the table, Silas Vance trailing behind me like a ghost from a past Arthur thought he had buried. I watched the color drain from Arthur's face as he recognized the old lawyer. I know, I said softly, my voice carrying a steadiness that seemed to vibrate through the mahogany. "You were worried about my fatigue. You thought the stress of a meeting like this would be too much for my delicate state. I know. There are times when you also feel like you've been forgotten in the very house you built, just like the way Beatrice stood on the balcony, watching her husband and son plot against her. A woman's sacrifice is often taken for granted, but you know what? Silence doesn't mean weakness." Julian stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You're making a scene. Elena, call security and have them escort Mr. Vance out. He doesn't have standing here." "Actually," Silas Vance's voice rasped, cutting through Julian's bravado like a cold wind, "I have more standing in this room than anyone except the lady standing beside me. I am here as the executor of the Martha Sterling Private Trust." Arthur slammed his pen down on the table, a blot of black ink staining the white page. "Martha's trust was dissolved years ago. I handled those filings myself. This is a desperate stunt, B. It's pathetic, and it's only proving the point we've been making about your mental health." I looked around the table at the other board members, men and women I'd known for decades. Margaret Coleman was watching me, her sharp eyes narrowed in fascination. I saw the doubt starting to flicker in the others. They had been told I was losing my mind, but I was the only one in the room whose hands weren't shaking. "Arthur," I said, leaning forward and resting my palms on the cool wood, "you've spent so much time looking at the buildings. You've spent so much time calculating the square footage of the spas and the occupancy rates of the villas. You've become so obsessed with the Sterling Haven empire that you forgot the most basic rule of the earth." "What are you talking about?" Arthur hissed. He reached for the contract, pulling it closer as if he could finish the signing before I could stop him. "I'm signing this deal with Vanguard. It's done. The board has approved the merger. We are liquidating the assets and moving forward." "You can sign whatever you want, Arthur," I said, and for the first time I let a small, sharp smile touch my lips. "But you cannot sell what you do not own." Elena let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Beatrice, we've reviewed the titles. The Sterling Haven LLC holds all corporate assets. Arthur is the managing partner. Your 40% is being transitioned under the guardianship filing. It's all legally sound." "The LLC owns the buildings, Elena," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded more attention than a shout. "The LLC owns the brand, the medical equipment, and the furniture. But 40 years ago, Martha Sterling saw exactly who her son was. She knew that one day, his greed would outrun his common sense." I nodded to Silas, who pulled a set of notarized, ancient-looking deeds from his briefcase and slid them across the table toward Robert Hartley, the board chairman. The land, I continued, the 68 acres of prime Atlantic coastline that every single Sterling Haven resort sits upon, that land was never transferred to the LLC. Martha kept the deeds in her maiden name, held in a private trust that only Silas knew about. And 20 years ago, she deeded 100% of that land to me. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Robert Hartley's eyes widen as he scanned the documents. I watched Arthur's hand go limp, the fountain pen rolling away and clattering onto the floor. "What?" Julian stammered, looking from the deeds to his father. "That's impossible. We've been paying taxes." "We've been. You've been paying the taxes into an escrow account that I've been managing through Silas for 2 decades, I said. "I've let you build your glass houses on my dirt because I wanted to believe you were doing it for the right reasons. I wanted to believe you were healing people. But you're not. You're selling poison to Vanguard so you can pay off your gambling debts, Julian. And you, Arthur. You're selling your mother's soul so you can run away with Sylvia Vane." Arthur surged to his feet, his face a mottled purple. "Those deeds are a forgery. My mother would never. I am her son." "She was also a woman, Arthur," I said, my heart feeling lighter with every word, and she knew what it felt like to be underestimated by a Sterling man. She knew that the only way to protect me was to give me the ground beneath your feet. I turned to the board. "Gentlemen, the Vanguard merger is dead. I am the landlord of this corporation, and I am formally denying any easement or land use rights to any entity associated with Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. Effective immediately, the rent for the land occupied by Sterling Haven LLC is being raised to a rate that I know the company cannot afford under its current embezzled management." Arthur sank back into his chair, looking suddenly very old and very small. The shark was realizing that the water had vanished, leaving him gasping on the sand. Elena was frantically typing on her laptop, but I could tell by the way her hands were trembling that she knew there was no legal bridge back from this. "This meeting is over," I said, standing up straight. "Arthur, Julian, you have 24 hours to vacate the executive offices. Robert, I'll be in touch regarding the restructuring of the board. I believe it's time Sterling Haven had a leadership that actually understands the value of a heartbeat." I walked out of the room without looking back, the sound of Martha's key jingling in my pocket. I had been a homemaker for 40 years, but today I had finally shown them who really owned the house. There is a specific kind of coldness that settles in a room when the people you thought were orchestrating your downfall realize they are merely instruments in someone else's symphony. For 40 years, I watched Arthur manipulate every board member, every contractor, and every family dynamic with the precision of a master puppeteer. He truly believed he was the architect of my erasure, a man so convinced of his own brilliance that he couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't the smartest person in the room. But as I stood at the foot of that mahogany table, watching the oxygen leave his lungs, I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I felt a profound, heavy sadness. I was looking at a man who had sold his soul to a son who didn't respect him, and a daughter-in-law who didn't even like him, all while convinced he was the one in control. Arthur's humiliation wasn't just about losing the land. It was about the realization that the goldfish he had mocked was the only one who had ever been truly loyal to him. The betrayal he felt from me was nothing compared to the jagged, hidden blade already pressed against his back by the people he had shared his glass of champagne with just the night before. The boardroom was thick with a silence, so heavy it felt physical. Robert Hartley was still clutching the land deeds, his hands trembling slightly as the legal reality of my ownership sank in. Arthur remained frozen, his eyes fixed on Silas Vance as if the old lawyer were a ghost that might vanish if he blinked hard enough. But it was Elena who moved first. She didn't look at me, she looked at Arthur, and for a split second, the mask of the supportive daughter-in-law slipped, revealing a calculating coldness that made my blood run cold. "This doesn't change the merger, Arthur," Elena hissed, her voice low and sharp. "The land rights can be litigated. We have the Vanguard capital. We move forward with the bankruptcy protection for the buildings and force an easement. Don't let her rattle you." Arthur didn't respond. He looked hollowed out. But Julian, driven by the frantic desperation of a man who owed money to people who didn't take litigation as an answer, slammed his fist on the table. "She's right. Mom, you can't just stop a multi-million-dollar deal because of some ancient piece of paper. We have contracts." "You do have contracts, Julian," I said, my voice as calm as the eye of a hurricane, "and that's exactly what we need to talk about. But not the Vanguard contract. We need to talk about the consulting agreement Elena signed 6 months ago with Vane Medical Sylvia Vane's company." The room shifted. Arthur's head snapped toward Elena. What are you talking about, Bea? Elena is our lead counsel. She's the one who found the Vanguard lead. I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim silver tablet, the one Julian had mocked me for not knowing how to use. With a few practice swipes, I mirrored the screen to the massive monitors on the wall. The air purifiers I had installed weren't just for dust. They had captured every keystroke on the sunroom's Wi-Fi network. While Julian was in the sunroom crying about his gambling debts, I began, watching Julian flinch. And while Arthur was in his study writing love letters to Sylvia Vane, Elena was busy. She wasn't just drafting my competency hearing documents. She was leaking the Sterling Haven proprietary medical protocols, the ones I designed directly to Sylvia Vane. On the screen, a series of encrypted emails flickered into view. They were from Elena to a private server owned by Vane Medical. They contained the exact blueprints for our facility expansions, our patient data, and, most importantly, a detailed plan on how to drive the Sterling Haven valuation down so Sylvia could buy the buildings for pennies on the dollar after the Vanguard merger inevitably collapsed under federal scrutiny. You weren't helping Arthur sell to Vanguard, Elena, I said, looking her directly in the eyes. You were setting Vanguard up as a stalking horse to bankrupt Arthur and Julian. You promised Sylvia that you would deliver the Sterling legacy on a silver platter in exchange for a partnership at her firm and a 20% finder's fee of the liquidated assets. Arthur turned to Elena, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Elena, is this true? Elena didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She simply closed her laptop and leaned back, her expression shifting into one of utter contempt. Arthur, please. You were ready to throw your wife into a sanitarium and sell your mother's life's work to a pharmaceutical chop shop so you could run off with a woman who has been laughing at you behind your back for years. Did you really think I was doing this out of family loyalty? She laughed, a short, jagged sound that filled the sterile room. You and Julian are a liability. You're messy, you're emotional, and you're predictable. Sylvia offered me a future. You offered me a front row seat to a sinking ship. I just made sure I had a lifeboat. You bitch, Julian screamed, lunging across the table, but Robert Hartley and another board member caught him. You were the one who told me Vanguard was the only way. You said you'd take care of the debts. I am taking care of them, Julian, Elena snapped. Once the company is liquidated, your debts will be part of the bankruptcy proceedings. You'll be broke, but you'll be alive. Consider it a wedding present. Arthur looked like he had been struck. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for the goldfish who would forgive him, the woman who would tuck him in and tell him it was all a mistake. But I stayed still. I wanted him to feel the full weight of the silence he had forced on me for 40 years. I trusted you, Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to Elena, the woman he had treated like a daughter, the one he had chosen over me. I gave you everything. I put the entire legal strategy in your hands. And that was your first mistake, Arthur, Elena replied, standing up and smoothing her skirt. You never trust a shark, especially when you've spent your whole life pretending you're one, but you're really just a man who got lucky because his mother had more sense than he did. She looked at me then, a flicker of genuine surprise, maybe even a tiny bit of respect crossing her face. I underestimated you, Beatrice. I didn't think you had the stomach for this. I was a surgeon, Elena, I said softly. I've spent my life looking at what's rotting inside people so I can cut it out. You're just another tumor. A particularly aggressive one, but a tumor nonetheless. Arthur put his head in his hands and began to weep. It wasn't the dignified cry of a tragic hero. It was the pathetic, shuddering sob of a man who realized he had destroyed his own house to build a monument to himself, only to find out he was the only one who believed in it. The board members began to murmur. The Vanguard representatives realized the deal was toxic and began to retreat toward the door, and Silas Vance stood beside me, as steady as a rock. The Sterling family was tearing itself apart in front of the very people they had tried to impress. Arthur, Julian, and Elena, 3 predators who had spent months plotting to devour me, were now locked in a cage of their own making, and I was the one holding the key. I realized then that my grandmother was right. The Sterling men were made of sand, and the tide hadn't just come in. It had taken everything back to the sea. The aftermath of a storm isn't always marked by thunder. Sometimes it is the most terrifying when it is perfectly, hauntingly quiet. As I stood in that boardroom, watching the people I had called my family turn on each other like starved animals, I realized that the woman I used to be the one who would have rushed to comfort Arthur or shield Julian from his own failures had finally died. In her place was someone who understood that mercy without justice is just another form of self-destruction. For 40 years I had mended the wounds in this family, stitched together the reputations they tore apart, and whispered reassurances while they sharpened their knives behind my back. But standing there, with the weight of Martha's legacy in my hands and the digital evidence of their greed glowing on the screens, I felt a clinical, surgical detachment. They weren't my husband and son in that moment. They were a systemic infection that had reached the heart of something sacred. I looked at the marble floors and the mahogany table, and I didn't see an empire anymore. I saw a crime scene, and I knew that for the healing to truly begin, I had to be the one to let the law perform the autopsy. The tension in the room snapped not with a shout, but with the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots in the corridor. I had made the call 30 minutes before I walked into the meeting, right after Silas Vance had verified the final chain of custody for the embezzlement records. I didn't look at Arthur as the heavy oak doors opened once more. I didn't have to. I could hear the way his breath hitched, a small, wheezing sound that reminded me of a collapsing lung. 3 men in dark suits, followed by 2 uniformed officers, entered the room. They didn't look like the corporate security Julian was used to bullying. These men had the weary, immovable faces of federal investigators. One of them, a man with a graying beard and a badge clipped to his belt, stepped toward the head of the table. "Arthur Sterling? Julian Sterling?" the officer asked. His voice was flat, devoid of the theatricality that Arthur usually employed. It was the voice of a man stating a mathematical fact. Julian was still red-faced, his eyes darting toward Elena, who had already distanced herself by moving toward the far window. "What is this? You can't just barge in here. Do you know who we are? We're in the middle of a private board meeting." "We're fully aware of who you are, Mr. Sterling," the officer replied, pulling a folded document from his pocket. "I'm Special Agent Miller with the Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant for the arrest of Julian Sterling on charges of federal wire fraud, money laundering, and the illegal diversion of corporate emergency funds. And we have a subpoena for all records pertaining to Arthur Sterling's involvement in the Vanguard Pharmaceuticals merger and the unauthorized liquidation of trust-held assets." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the faint hum of the air purifiers I had installed, the very devices that had gathered the evidence now leading to this moment. Julian's face went from a mottled red to a ghostly, translucent white. He looked at Arthur, his mouth hanging open, waiting for the man who had always fixed his messes to step in one last time. But Arthur was staring at me. His hands were flat on the table, and for the first time in my life I saw him tremble. Not a small shake, but a deep structural vibration. "B," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "You didn't. You wouldn't do this to your own son. Think of the name. Think of the Sterling reputation." I looked at him, and I didn't see the titan of industry I had once feared. I saw a man who was still trying to use reputation as a shield for a rotting soul. "I am thinking of the name Arthur," I said, my voice sounding strange even to me, calm, low, and utterly certain. "The Sterling name used to mean healing. It used to mean a sanctuary. You and Julian turned it into a laundromat for gambling debts and a warehouse for counterfeit medicine. The reputation didn't die today. It died the moment you decided I was an obstacle to be removed." Agent Miller gestured to the officers. "Julian Sterling, you're under arrest. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." The sound of the handcuffs clicking was a sharp, metallic punctuation to 28 years of enabling. Julian began to sob a loud, ugly sound that filled the room, but no one moved to help him. Elena stood by the window, her back turned, already a stranger. Arthur watched as they led our youngest son toward the door, his eyes wide and vacant. "As for you, Arthur," I said, turning my chair to face him fully. The board members were silent, watching the transition of power as if they were seeing a coronation they hadn't expected. "The board has seen the evidence of the embezzlement. They've seen the land deeds Martha left to me. Under the bylaws that you yourself drafted in 1998 to ensure absolute executive authority, the majority shareholder has the right to remove the CEO for cause without a prior vote if criminal activity is documented." I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't a voluntary retirement form like the one they had tried to force on me. It was a formal notice of termination for cause and a permanent trespass order. "You are being removed as CEO and chairman, effective immediately," I continued. "Your access to all corporate accounts has been frozen. The security detail outside is waiting to escort you to the lobby. You are not to take anything but your personal effects. Silas has already filed for a legal separation on my behalf, and I've petitioned the court to freeze our joint assets pending a full forensic audit. Arthur looked at the paper as if it were written in a language he didn't understand. Where am I supposed to go, B? This is my building. This is my life. It was Martha's land, Arthur. And now it's mine, I said. You spent 10 years telling me I was uncomplicated and academic. You told everyone I was losing my mind so you could steal what didn't belong to you. I think it's time you find out what it's like to be the one who isn't invited to the meeting. Arthur stood up slowly. He looked at the board members, searching for an ally, but Robert Hartley and Margaret Coleman just looked away. He had spent his life being a predator, and he was finally realizing that in a room full of sharks, there is no loyalty for a wounded one. You're cold, Beatrice, he muttered, his voice dripping with a final, desperate venom. You've become a monster. No, Arthur, I replied, standing up to meet his gaze one last time. I've just become a surgeon again, and I've finally finished the operation. I watched as the security guards led him out of the room. He didn't look back. The doors closed, and for the first time in 40 years, the air in the Sterling Tower felt clean. I turned back to the remaining board members, who were sitting in stunned silence. Robert, I said, addressing the chairman, I believe we have a lot of work to do. Let's start with the cancellation of the Vanguard contract and a full audit of the patient care funds. I'll be taking over as interim chair until a permanent, ethical leadership can be established. I sat down in the head chair, the seat Arthur had occupied for 4 decades. It was still warm from his body, but I didn't mind. I opened my leather notebook, the one Julian had laughed at, and picked up a pen. The goldfish was gone, the doctor was in, and the Sterling Empire was finally under new, and much more careful, management. They say that being a mother is like living with your heart walking around outside of your body, vulnerable and exposed to every sharp edge of the world. For 28 years, I watched Julian grow from a soft, laughing toddler into a man who looked at me with a coldness that felt like a surgical blade. I blamed myself for a long time, wondering if my silence during Arthur's rages had taught him that women were meant to be ignored, or if the luxury I had helped build had simply rotted his sense of consequence. But sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit visitors' room of the county detention center, the smell of industrial bleach and old despair clinging to the walls, I realized that I couldn't fix a soul that didn't want to be mended. I looked at the heavy glass partition separating us and saw not a powerful heir or a high-stakes gambler, but a frightened boy who had finally run out of people to lie to. It's a devastating thing to realize that the person you gave life to is the same person who tried to steal yours, not with a weapon, but with a pen and a smirk. I had spent his whole life building a safety net for him, but today I wasn't here to catch him. I was here to show him the ground. The room was noisy, filled with the low hum of other families whispering through phones and the rhythmic clinking of a guard's keys. When Julian was let in, his orange jumpsuit looked garish against his pale, sunken skin. He hadn't shaved in days, and the arrogance that usually sat on his shoulders like a tailored coat had completely evaporated. He grabbed the receiver with trembling fingers, his eyes darting to the guards before settling on mine with a desperate, watery intensity. "Mom," he choked out, his voice cracking. "Thank God. You have to get me out of here. My lawyer says the bail is astronomical. And Dad, the guards say Dad's accounts are frozen. They're talking about years, Mom. Federal years." I didn't pick up the phone immediately. I just looked at him, tracing the lines of his face that so closely mirrored my own. I thought about the time he was 7 and had scraped his knee. I had stayed up all night holding a cold compress to it, whispering that everything would be okay. I thought about how, just 72 hours ago, he had stood in our sunroom and laughed at the idea of me being declared mentally incompetent. Slowly, I lifted the receiver. "Hello, Julian. Mom, listen to me." He leaned in, his breath fogging the glass. "Elena, that bitch, she set us up. She's the reason the feds showed up. You have to use the Sterling Haven reserves. You still have the land titles, right? Use them as collateral. Get me a real defense team, not this public defender who looks like he just graduated. I can't stay here. These people, they're not like us." "You're right, Julian," I said, my voice sounding hollow and steady in my own ears. "These people aren't like you. Most of them didn't have a mother who sacrificed her career to ensure they had every advantage. Most of them didn't have a trust fund they could gamble away in Macau while pretending to be an executive." Julian flinched as if I had struck him. "Why are you talking like this? I'm your son. You can't leave me here. I know I messed up with the Vanguard thing, But I was just trying to help the family. Dad was the one who pushed the merger. The truth is about to be revealed, and a major turning point is waiting just ahead. Please stay with me until these final moments, and if you feel empathy for Beatrice, subscribe to the channel to support her in her search for justice. I reached into the small bag I was allowed to bring and pulled out a worn, blue-covered book. I held it up against the glass so he could see the title, Principles of Internal Medicine, 12th edition. The spine was cracked, and there was a faint, circular stain on the cover from a coffee cup I'd set down during a long night of studying decades ago. Julian's eyes narrowed in confusion. What is that? Why did you bring a textbook? Do you remember this, Julian? I asked. 3 years ago, when you were moving into your new penthouse, you found this in a box in the attic. You told me it was clutter. You told me that my old life as a surgeon was a failed experiment and that I should stop clinging to the past because I was just a housewife now. I found this in the trash can outside after you left that day. Mom, I was stressed. I didn't mean. You did mean it, I interrupted. You meant every word because you believed that money was the only thing that gave a person value. You thought that because I didn't have a flashy title anymore, I was something to be discarded. You threw away the foundation of who I was, so you could feel superior. I lowered the book, my hand gripping it tightly. I'm not paying your bail, Julian, and I'm not using my land to clear your debts. Arthur is facing his own reckoning, and Elena has already disappeared. You are exactly where your choices have led you. Julian began to cry then, but it wasn't the cry of a repentant man. It was the loud, jagged sob of a child who had finally been told no. He began to pound on the glass, the sound echoing through the small room. You can't do this. I'm a Sterling. You're destroying my life over a stupid book? I'm not destroying your life, Julian. I'm letting you experience it, I said, my heart breaking with every word, but my resolve remaining as firm as a surgical knot. I've spent 40 years mending what you and your father broke. I'm done. You wanted to be a man of the world, a shark in the deep water. Well, this is what the bottom looks like. I stood up, sliding the textbook back into my bag. Julian was screaming now, his words muffled by the glass, his face twisted in a mask of rage and terror. The guards began to move toward him, their hands on their belts. I brought you that book because I want you to read it, I said, leaning close to the glass one last time. Not for the medicine, but for the discipline. It takes years of hard work and humility to understand the value of a single life. You need to learn how to be a person before you ever learn how to spend money again. I love you, Julian. But I love the woman I used to be more than I love the lie you wanted me to become. I turned my back on him then. I didn't look back even when I heard the sound of the metal door clanging shut behind him as they led him away. I walked out into the bright, indifferent sunlight of the parking lot and took a deep, shuddering breath. I was a mother who had just lost her son to the truth, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt like I was finally standing on solid ground, and the wind, for once, was at my back. They say that at 65, a woman should be settling into the quiet rhythms of a life already written, watching the sunset from a porch swing and letting the world go on without her. For 40 years, I played that part, keeping my voice low and my presence small, convinced that my value was measured by the peace I maintained in a house that was slowly suffocating me. But as I signed the final decree of divorce in Silas Vance's quiet office, the scratch of the pen on the thick cream paper didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a key turning in a lock that had been jammed for decades. I looked at Arthur, sitting across from me without his fleet of lawyers or his tailored confidence, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to apologize for his discomfort. I realized that freedom isn't always a grand, sweeping gesture. Sometimes it's just the simple, heavy silence of a man who has finally run out of things to steal. I walked out of that office into the crisp autumn air of Boston, and I didn't feel like a woman who had lost her husband or her status. I felt like a surgeon who had finally finished a grueling, life-saving operation on herself, and for the first time in my 65 years, the heartbeat I was listening to was my own. The house on the coast, the grand estate that had once felt like the center of the Sterling universe, was eerily still the day Arthur came to collect his personal things. I had already arranged for the locks to be changed, not out of spite, but as a necessary boundary. I stood by the large bay window in the sunroom, the same room where he and Julian had whispered about my cognitive decline, and watched his taxi pull up the long gravel driveway. He didn't arrive in the black Mercedes that had been a corporate lease, and the board had already reclaimed the keys. He arrived in a yellow cab, looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his age and everything to do with his lack of an audience. I let him in, but I stayed by the door. He walked through the foyer, his eyes darting toward the walls where the expensive art had already been appraised and tagged for the corporate audit. He looked like a stranger in a museum, realizing too late that he never actually owned the exhibits. "I suppose you're enjoying this, Bea," he said, his voice flat, stripped of the booming authority that used to make the staff tremble, seeing me leave with a couple of suitcases like a common vagrant. "I built this place. I gave you a life that most women would kill for." I watched him fold a silk shirt, his movements clumsy. "You built a theater, Arthur, and you gave me a script, but you never gave me a life. You spent 40 years trying to convince me that I was lucky to be your shadow, while you used my mind and my mother-in-law's land to fund your vanity." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small laminated card, his new identification. "Silas has arranged for the modest stipend, Martha, left in a secondary trust for your basic needs. It's enough for a small apartment in Florida and a quiet life. It's exactly what you told me I deserved when you were drafting those competency papers. I think you'll find that uncomplicated living is quite peaceful once you get used to it." Arthur stopped packing, his shoulders slumped. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of the man I had married in 1986. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of bitter resentment. "You're a cold woman, Beatrice." "No, Arthur," I said softly, opening the door for him. "I'm just a woman who finally learned how to say no. Please, take your things. The taxi is waiting, and I have a board meeting at Sterling Haven in an hour." Watching him walk down those stone steps with 2 scuffed suitcases was one of the most quiet, profound moments of my life. There were no shouts, no dramatic music, just the sound of a man who had walked into this family with nothing, leaving with exactly what he had brought himself. But the real work began at Sterling Haven. The board had been terrified when I first took over as interim chair, expecting me to sell everything and disappear. Instead, I walked into the first meeting with a stack of blueprints and a vision that had been simmering in the back of my mind since I hung up my lab coat 30 years ago. "The Vanguard deal is dead," I told the room of stunned executives, "and the era of luxury-only medicine is over. We are sitting on 68 acres of the most beautiful healing land on the East Coast. And as of today, 30% of our clinical space is being converted into the Martha Sterling Women's Pavilion." I looked at Robert Hartley, who was leaning forward, his brow furrowed. "Beatrice, the profit margins on a free clinic." "I don't care about the profit margins, Robert," I interrupted, my voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "I own the land. If you want to continue operating the luxury spa and the private villas, you will subsidize the clinic. We are going to provide world-class cardiac and surgical care to women who have been told they can't afford to stay alive. We are going to treat the grandmothers, the mothers, and the daughters who have spent their lives caring for everyone else while their own health was ignored." I spent the next few months in a whirlwind of activity that should have exhausted me, but instead, it felt like I was being plugged into a high-voltage current. I was in the halls of the resort every day, but I wasn't checking the thread count of the towels anymore. I was overseeing the installation of state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment. I was hiring female surgeons who had been passed over for promotions in male-dominated city hospitals. I was walking through the gardens Martha had planted, seeing them not as a backdrop for a cocktail party, but as a space for patients to breathe. One afternoon I sat on a bench near the new pavilion, watching a young woman walk her mother through the rose bushes. The mother was wearing a hospital gown and a soft cardigan, her face pale but her eyes bright with the first spark of recovery. They didn't know who I was. To them, I was just a silver-haired woman in a sensible navy blazer, enjoying the afternoon sun. I felt a tear prick my eye, but I didn't wipe it away. I thought about the goldfish Julian had laughed at and the homemaker Arthur had tried to erase. They were gone. In their place was a woman who had reclaimed her title, her legacy, and her soul. At 65, I wasn't settling into the quiet. I was just getting started. I had spent 40 years being an anchor for a sinking ship, but now I was the tide. And as the sun began to set over the Atlantic, casting long, golden shadows across the land that was finally, truly mine, I realized that freedom doesn't feel like flying. It feels like standing on a foundation that you built with your own 2 hands, knowing that no matter how hard the wind blows, you aren't going anywhere. There is a profound humming stillness that settles over a life once the noise of other people's expectations finally falls away. For 40 years, I believed that my story was merely a footnote in the grand biography of Arthur Sterling, a quiet melody playing softly in the background of his thunderous ambition. I thought my silver hair and the lines around my eyes were markers of a slow fading, a gradual disappearing act that every woman of a certain age is expected to perform. But as I stand on the cliffs of Sterling Haven today, looking out over the Atlantic where the water meets the sky in a seamless line of blue, I realized that I wasn't fading at all. I was molting. I was shedding the heavy, suffocating skin of a persona that never belonged to me to reveal the woman underneath the doctor, the architect, the survivor. It is a terrifying and beautiful thing to reach the age of 65 and realize that you are finally, for the first time, the author of your own days. The secrets that once threatened to drown me have become the very ground I stand on, solid and unyielding. I am no longer looking for a seat at someone else's table. I have built my own house, on my own land, and the light in the windows is entirely of my own making. The Martha Sterling Women's Pavilion has been open for 6 months now, and the air there feels different than any other part of the resort. It doesn't smell of expensive perfumes or the forced ozone of high-end spas. It smells of hope, of sterile bandages, and the faint, sweet scent of the sea air blowing through the open recovery wards. I spend most of my mornings there, not as a ghost in the background, but as the woman who knows every square inch of the foundation. I've traded my silk gowns for comfortable trousers and a white coat that feels like a long-lost friend draped over my shoulders. Last Tuesday, I was walking through the garden when I saw a woman sitting on a stone bench, clutching a small, worn leather Bible. Her name was Clara, a retired schoolteacher from a small town 3 states away who had been told her heart was a lost cause because she didn't have the insurance to cover a valve replacement. Our surgeons had operated on her 2 days prior. When she saw me, she didn't see the majority shareholder of a real estate empire. She saw a woman who looked like she understood what it meant to carry a heavy burden. "It's a miracle, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice still a bit raspy from the intubation. "To be given a second chance when you thought the door was already closed." I sat down beside her, the autumn sun warming my face. "It's not a miracle, Clara. It's justice. You spent 40 years teaching children how to read and dream. The world owed you this heartbeat." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. I thought about Arthur, who was now living in a small 2-bedroom condo in a retirement community in Florida, spending his days playing bridge with men who didn't know his name or his history. I thought about Julian, who still had 3 years left on his sentence, reading the medical textbooks I sent him and writing letters that were slowly, painfully beginning to sound like they came from a human being instead of a brand. I didn't feel anger toward them anymore. Anger is a fire that requires your own spirit for fuel, and I had decided long ago that they had consumed enough of mine. Instead, I felt a quiet, expansive peace. I realized that my mother-in-law, Martha, hadn't just left me land and tattered letters. She had left me a map to my own courage. She knew that the Sterling men would always try to build their castles on top of the women who loved them, and she made sure that when the walls eventually crumbled, as they always do when built on greed, I would have something real to hold on to. I walked back to the main building, nodding to the staff. They no longer looked at me with pity or confusion. They looked at me with a reserved, steady respect. They knew that I was the one who had stopped the Vanguard merger, the one who had personally audited the books to ensure every nurse was paid a fair wage, and the one who had refused to sell the soul of this place for a quick profit. In the late afternoon, I retreated to my private study, the one Martha had used in the brownstone, which I had moved, piece by piece, to the estate. I sat at the mahogany desk and opened my notebook. I wasn't tracking embezzlement or recording secret conversations anymore. I was sketching out plans for a new residency program, a way to mentor the next generation of female cardiac surgeons so they would never have to choose between their scalpels and their families the way I once did. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the old cream-colored envelope Silas Vance had handed me on that chaotic anniversary night. I ran my thumb over the notary seal, thinking about the Rangzoi Zung Vanguithun. Arthur and Julian were my flesh and blood, yet they had been the most dangerous strangers I had ever known. Martha had been my mother-in-law by law, but she had been my true kin in spirit. She had seen me when I was invisible, and in doing so, she had given me the permission to see myself. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. I stood up and walked to the balcony, the same balcony where I had once stood feeling like a goldfish in a tank. The wind was cold now, biting with the promise of winter, but I didn't pull back. I leaned into it. I was 65 years old, and my life was no longer a supporting role. It was a masterpiece in progress. I had lost a husband and a son to the truth, but I had gained a soul. And as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, I knew that no matter how many years I had left, they would be lived in the light. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and click on the next video to see more meaningful journeys. Beatrice taught us that an old envelope from a mother-in-law doesn't just contain money, but the recognition of a lifetime of sacrifice. Sometimes, the boundary between a stranger and a relative is separated only by a single act of kindness. Thank you for listening.